What we're going to do this morning then for the next roughly half an hour is look at a few things. First of all, look in some detail at some of the interesting aspects of the UK-wide results. Then look in a little bit more detail at exactly what happened in Wales. And then try and a few sort of tentative words of explanation. I mean, explaining the election outcome, certainly for an election as interesting as this, is going to take people like me stuck in our lonely garrets many an evening. But some initial thoughts and interpretation now. So first of all, we'll look at the results then on a UK-wide basis. What happened? This slide here is the basic outline of percentage of vote. Changes on 2010 and the seats, and again with the changes on 2010. Just a couple of things to point out here immediately. First of all, Labour rise in vote share is roughly double that of the Conservatives from last time. Yet, of course, Labour ends up losing seats while the Conservatives end up gaining them. Now, partly that's due to Scotland, partly that's due to other factors, which we'll talk about in more detail a bit later on. Huge increase in the UKIP vote share, of course, getting a grand total of 1 seat. With just over a third of that vote share, the SNP get 56 times as many seats, and the whole issue of proportionality is another one that we'll return to later. But looking just beyond the headline numbers, I think there's a few important things that you may well want to look at and focus on. First of all, there's been, as I'll show in a minute, a pretty long-term trend towards the decline in elections in the dominance of Labour and the Conservative parties. Their vote share combined has been going down and down and largely down over the last 40, 50 years. That was very slightly reversed this time round. But with the decline of the Liberal Democrats, the process of the fragmentation of the British party system certainly has continued and indeed has been extended very substantially. So if we look outside the traditional main 3 UK parties, we see a big rise in share of the vote going to others. And I'll illustrate this in the following 2 slides. These 2 slides essentially show the same information but in a rather different form. So first of all, this one shows kind of how we tend to think about general elections historically. So there's a blue line here for the Conservative share of the vote, there's a red line for Labour, and I mean this is how we tend to think about most elections in the past. So say in the 80s, the blue line was ahead, the Conservatives were winning. Then, this is Tony Blair's era here, where the red line is ahead. I mean that's basically how we tend to think historically about most general elections. The next slide here is going to present exactly the same information, but in a slightly different form. Well, very different form. Here we have, for every general election from 1950 onwards, aggregate share of the vote. These purple bars are combined Conservative and Labour share. And you see, say, in the 1950s, that was generally above 90%. So of those who voted, well over 90% of people were voting either Conservative or Labour. And the general trend since the 1950s has been for this aggregate Conservative and Labour share to be going down. Okay, it doesn't go down at every single election, but the broad trend is very clearly downwards. Well, this time, okay, after an all-time low of 65.1% in 2010, this time the combined Conservative and Labour share was up a little bit. But a great deal of that is because what has been the major part of the decline in Conservative and Labour share historically, the Liberals, then Alliance, and Liberal Democrats, of course, shrank very considerably from their 2010 share. This black bit at the top, this is the share of the vote taken by other parties. So that's SNP, Plaid Cymru, Ulster parties, parties that have been and gone, like the Referendum Party, basically everyone except Conservatives, Labour and Liberals, Liberal Democrats. And we see that has also generally been tending to increase, but there was a huge increase this time. So fully a quarter of people who voted at this general election voted for parties other than the 3 main traditional Westminster parties. That's far bigger than we've seen any of these other elections, and indeed far bigger than has ever been seen before. So that's one major feature of the UK-wide results. A second feature, though, is that fragmentation was not just between parties, in terms of more parties winning significant shares of the vote, but also between nations. The United Kingdom has never looked less united in electoral terms before. And this was the first ever general election where the party coming first in each of the constituent nations was a different one. So in England, clearly, the Conservatives got the most votes and seats. In Scotland, by a very long way, it was the SNP. In Wales, of course, it was Labour, Northern Ireland, the DUP. So 4 different nations, 4 different parties coming first, and we've never seen that before, ever. Third notable feature of the results, of course, is disproportionality, the apparently almost arbitrary relationship between votes won and seats won. And the fragmentation between different parties under the first past the post system does tend to lead towards high levels of disproportionality. And particularly we see UKIP and to a lesser extent the Greens winning lots of votes, millions of votes, yet 1 seat each. This means that by all international standards, this year's UK general election produced a very disproportional outcome. You see very few countries in the world that produce elections where the relationship between votes and seats is as weak, or you might say incorrect or whatever, than we saw in the UK this year. But this is not a new problem. This next slide shows, this is the Gallagher Index of Disproportionality. I'm sure you all love to hear about that before 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. The Gallagher Index, invented by Michael Gallagher of Trinity College Dublin, measures the disproportionality of voting outcomes. Basically, it runs from 0, which 0 would be where the percentage of votes and seats matches exactly, which pretty much never happens, through to, well, theoretically it could go up to 100, albeit 100 would mean that all the seats were given to parties that had won none of the votes, which is relatively unlikely. In practice, anything into double figures indicates pretty serious disproportionality in the relationship between votes and seats. What we see here, basically, I've tracked all of the elections back to 51. I need to go back, actually, to 1950 as well. Sorry. But basically, all of the elections up to and including 1970, the Gallagher Index score is below 10. And for all of the general elections since, it's above 10. And actually, this is February 1974, there isn't really much of an upward trend. It's basically, all of these elections are pretty disproportional. So, in the election this year, the UKIP are suffering particularly egregiously from the way the electoral system operates. But this is not a new problem. In, say, 1983, which is somewhere along here, for instance, it was the SDP Liberal Alliance getting almost 26% of the vote, 2% of the seats. So, the particular parties that are suffering most egregiously from the electoral system may have changed. But the basic problem, if you regard it as a problem, which I do, is one that actually has been continuing at a pretty similar level for 40 or more years. UK elections are very disproportional in their outcomes. They were this year, but they have been for some time. Fourth feature of the UK results, turnout. It was expected by many people there would be a significant rise in the overall turnout from 2010 for a few reasons, most obvious being the very closeness, apparently, of the election result. Closer elections do tend to bring out more voters because it seems like your vote might actually matter. Also, it was suggested by many people that both UKIP and the Greens were tapping a significant element of their support from people who had been alienated from the traditional parties. Those parties would therefore bring in previous non-voters to participate in the election. Well, this didn't happen, actually, to a very great extent. And basically, there was a big turnout change in Scotland. other than that, not a whole hell of a lot happened in terms of turnout. We see pretty tiny rises in Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. Scotland, yes, I mean, something does seem to have happened. I should point out, by the way, this figure for Scotland, that is of the registered electorate. Now, the registered electorate in Scotland has itself increased substantially in the last 18 months. Lots of people got registered before the referendum. So this is an increase in turnout share on an increased electorate. And yeah, the referendum seems to have been associated with a substantial change in levels of political engagement and consciousness in Scotland. So that's seen a significant change. Outside Scotland, very little actually happened in terms of turnout. UKIP and the Greens were not drawing large numbers of previous non-voters into the electorate. Or if they were, then we were losing quite a few other voters somewhere. So if you look at an overall graph of turnout, well, I mean, basically it was very high in the immediate post-war years. Then it was always somewhere in the 70% up to and including 1997. And then at every election since 1997, turnout has been below 70%. And okay, it has edged up a bit since 2001, but the change this time round was pretty tiny and, as I say, largely down to Scotland. And Scotland brings me to my final main point on the UK election results, the extraordinary results we saw there. What's been described by American stats guru Nate Silver as an out-of-sample event. That means we just haven't seen anything like this before. I've been following elections with considerable interest since 1979. That was the first general election I took a great interest in. I was an unusual 8-year-old. During all of that time, 36 years, clearly the most dramatic general election I've ever seen was that of 1997, the Tony Blair landslide. Or, well, actually on the night, general election night, Professor Anthony King on the BBC said at one point that landslide is far too weak a word to describe what's going on. And he offered the metaphor of an asteroid hitting the planet and destroying practically all life on Earth. Now, Anthony King there was talking about an election where the Conservatives lost about half of the seats that they were defending from 1992. And Labour increased its number of seats by about 60%. So that's an asteroid hitting the planet and destroying practically all life on Earth. Well, how then do we describe Scotland, where Labour, lost 97.6% of the seats they were defending, and the SNP increased their seat total by 833, well, actually that's rounded down, 833.33%. Yes, I'm out of metaphors and similes to use for that. I mean, this is truly astonishing. SNP substantially more than doubling their vote share, and point out they came within less than 4,500 votes, fewer than 4,500 votes, of winning every single seat in Scotland. The only Conservative MP, David Mundell, won his seat by fewer than 800. Alistair Carmichael in Orkney and Shetland won by, I think it was 819. And Ian Murray for Labour in Edinburgh South won by just over 2,000. So, just 2,200 voters choosing differently across 3 seats, and the SNP would have won everything. And this is something we just haven't seen in UK electoral politics, I think, in the living memory, not just of me, but indeed of anyone here in this room. Compared to Scotland, the results in Wales look somewhat less dramatic, I'm afraid. But nonetheless, I think are worth looking at in some detail. This slide, first of all, then, is the overall result in terms of vote share and changes since 2010. Obviously, we see, as elsewhere, the Liberal Democrats doing very badly, UKIP having a big rise in vote share. These 3 top parties, though, here, it's interesting to note their changes in vote share are not much different. The Conservatives have a very slightly higher rise in vote share than Plaid, whose rise is in turn very slightly higher than Labour, but there's not a great deal of difference. Yet that leads to rather different outcomes in terms of seats. So the Conservatives making a notable step forward, or Plaid are stuck where they are, and Labour actually, against most expectations, lost ground. Now, I thought it would be useful to look at these results in detail by party. As we start with Labour, in Wales we always start with the Labour Party. And this was the 20th general election in a row from 1935 onwards where Labour won both the most votes and a majority of seats. So congratulations to them for winning in Wales again. But this was Labour's second lowest vote share in Wales since 1918. Only 2010 has been worse. Labour was doing better in terms of vote share in Wales under Michael Foot in 1983 than they did this year. Another thing I'll point out, and this is a theme I'll get back to in a few minutes, is in terms of where Labour was getting its vote shares, particularly where we see some of the biggest changes. So on this side of the chart, Labour's five best vote share changes from 2010. Well, Cardiff Central, that was obviously very good for them, one key target seat. But other than that, it's Merthyr, Tydfil, Swansea, West, Blaenau Gwent, seats that Labour were going to win anyway, comfortably. And Brecon and Radnor was a seat where Labour was never really seriously in the game. In terms of its worst vote share changes, well, a couple of these seats, Carmarthen, West and South Pembrokeshire, a seat that Labour thought they had realistic prospects of winning. Vale of Clwyd, of course, one of their shock losses on the night. And there's an interesting contrast here with the Conservatives, which I'll get to in a second. Just briefly point out first, though, on the Conservatives, their highest number of seats in Wales since the very high watermark of Thatcherism in 1983. Conservatives won more seats in Wales this year than they did in 1987 or in 1992. Although they did so, they won those 11 seats on a noticeably lower vote share than they won in 87 or 92. And what we see with the Conservatives, I think, is a party being astonishingly effective at getting out the votes where it needs them. And if we look at its best and worst vote share changes, well, other than the slightly eccentric instance of Wrexham, look at these others, the best Conservative vote share changes. So Aberconwy, a potentially vulnerable seat they captured in 2010. Gower, their other supplies win on the night. Cardiff North, hitherto the most marginal seat in Wales. Oh, this again. And Brecon and Radnor, their key target seat. Sorry, can you still hear me above the alarm? Okay, right, I'll carry on then. And then we look at the Conservatives' worst vote share changes. Well, other than the, again, slightly eccentric instance of the seat of the Secretary of State for Wales, all of these worst vote share changes are on seats where the Conservatives were not in the game anyway and were not remotely targeting. So, they were losing votes where it didn't matter to them and mostly gaining votes where it did matter. UKIP, I think the main thing to say about UKIP is the contrast with Scotland. In the 59 seats in Scotland, UKIP stood 41 candidates. Every single UKIP candidate in Scotland lost their deposit. In Wales, UKIP stood candidates in all 40 seats and none of them lost their deposit. So Wales is not Scotland. It's interesting, though, that UKIP's lowest vote share anywhere was 6.5%, so they didn't lose a single deposit anywhere in Wales. Their highest vote share, though, was still below 20%. This was an amazingly evenly balanced vote share. But where we do see some relative strength, it's in South East Wales. Their 5 highest vote shares were all in the South East Wales region, out of the 8 seats in South East Wales. So, that would suggest, I think, for instance, for next year, that UKIP are particularly in South East Wales in a strong position, say, to be winning list seats. Also point out just their highest vote share anywhere was in Neil Kinnock's old seat. And Plaid Cymru, well, the good news, their vote share is up for the first time in general elections since 2001, the third highest vote share ever. But, still losing 7 deposits, still, of course, making no net gains in seats. And I think, as with Labour, we see a very patchy pattern in terms of where they were doing relatively badly and relatively well. So their best vote share changes, okay, one in Arvon, hitherto marginal seat, so that was very good for them. But other than that, largely in the seats where this year at least, Plaid were really not in the game seriously. And we look at vote share changes, the worst ones. Well, Llanelli was their sort of outside target seat. Aberconwy, a seat they'd be looking to target for next year. Different Meirionydd, I think, is more explicable when you have a popular incumbent member standing down. But these two in particular, I think, should certainly worry Plaid Cymru, both for this year and for next year. And the Liberal Democrats, well, my good friend John Curtis, who I'm sure you've all seen at various points in the media the last few months, was saying the other day that Nick Clegg has taken the Liberal Democrats back to 1970. Well, not in Wales he hasn't. It's worse than that, actually. This was the Lib Dems' worst vote share in Wales since 1966. Because Megan Lloyd George was still alive, the last time they did this badly. And as with the European elections last year, the Liberal Democrats did badly everywhere, but their vote share in Wales was even lower than it was in England or in Scotland. Because they lost 30 deposits. And you see their vote share declining absolutely everywhere, and by fairly considerable amounts. So, right. In the pre-election briefing, as some of you who are here then will recall, we classified for each of the parties the seats in Wales into four distinct types for each party, based on the categorisations of whether the party currently held the seat or didn't hold it, whether the party was uncompetitive in that seat or whether that was a competitive seat for the party. That gave, for each party, four categories of seats. Safe seats, uncompetitive ones they already have, hopeless seats, uncompetitive ones they don't have, and these where we'd expect to see most of the action, the active defences and the target seats. I think if we go back and review how those seats were categorised at our pre-election briefing, that tells a really interesting story, particularly for the two largest parties. For Labour, I suggested, perhaps rather rashly before the election, that 24 of the 26 seats they currently held were likely to be safe. Well, they held 22 of those, but against most people's expectations actually lost to the Conservatives both Gower and the Vale of Clwyd. They did, on the other hand, hold two seats that had been targeted by Plaid Cymru, Ynys Môn and Plaid's sort of stretch goal of Llanelli, which Labour actually held very comfortably. But look at, this is the list of plausible, well, down to plausible-ish Labour target seats in Wales at the general election. Yes, okay, they picked off Cardiff Central quite comfortably against the hapless Liberal Democrats. But other than that, nothing. Didn't win any of these seats, either from Plaid Cymru or from the Conservatives. Now contrast that with the Conservatives. Held the two seats that we would very much have expected them to hold, but also held all of those seats that might plausibly have been seen as potentially vulnerable marginals, and captured their obvious key target seat, and even gone into capturing two seats that most people before the election hadn't expected them to get. And all of that for a vote share that was up by just 1.1 percentage points from 2010. It's an astonishingly effective election campaign in terms of defending what they had and getting three additional seats. For the Liberal Democrats, well, as ever at the moment, the news is bad. They held one seat, largely thanks to the astonishing effectiveness of the local profile of the MP in Ceredigion. Pretty comfortably lost their other two. And Plaid Cymru, well, for Plaid, it's very much a tale of sort of above and below this line. The three seats they already held, they held pretty comfortably, and it's increasing their margins in Arvon and Carmarthen East. Arvon had looked pretty vulnerable before the election, didn't look so by the end of the election, but made no ground at all in terms of seat gains Okay, they got pretty close in Ynysmon, but were still some way off in Ceredigion and a lot further off in Llanelli. So that's kind of how the electoral background worked out. Effectively, I think the Conservatives fought very effectively on that battleground, the other parties much less so. Final element of my remarks, you may be relieved to hear, just a few points then of, so that's a detailed analysis of the results. So why did we get those results? Looking at a few things that we need to explain now. Well, a first point in terms of why, I think a key element is, the relationship between votes and seats, how votes translate into seats. In a non-proportional voting system, that relationship can often be complex. In this election, yes, it was complex, but it was also strikingly unbalanced. In England, as you may not have noticed from the way the election has been discussed, there was actually a net swing from 2010 from the Conservatives to the Labour Party of 1.1%. Now, that should have seen the Labour Party make a net gain of 15 seats. Actually, they made a net gain from the Conservatives of 4. Now, straight away, that's your Conservative majority. Labour gains another 11 seats from the Conservatives. Conservatives are down at 320 seats. They don't have a parliamentary majority. So immediately we see in England, Labour's relative ineffectiveness in the key Labour-Conservative marginals is an important part of the election outcome. We see also in Wales, actually, a somewhat similar story. In Wales there was a very tiny swing from Labour to Conservatives, a net swing of 0.2%. Applied vaguely uniformly across Wales, that shouldn't have seen any seat changes between the Conservatives and Labour. Of course, the Conservatives captured both the Vale of Clwyd and Gower. So a big part of trying to understand why we got the election outcome this year is understanding why the Conservatives' local campaigning was so effective. The Conservatives didn't do spectacularly well at the election this year in terms of overall number of votes. They didn't raise their vote share substantially, but they were very effective, much more effective than any of the other parties in Wales and indeed in England as well, at getting the votes out where they needed them. Now, in some places that may well be due to the well-known first-time incumbency effect, when someone who won a seat last time is standing to retain it for the first time. That may well have helped the Conservatives in some places. Of course, it didn't particularly help them in Cardiff North because the sitting member was standing down. So that may contribute to explaining the Conservative success, but there's clearly a lot more to it than that. Another factor that may be important, and there's been suggestions from the British election study team already that they're finding some of this in their data, is that the Conservatives made a big effort at squeezing UKIP supporters in the key marginal seats. Basically, scaring the whatever out of them by, you don't really want Ed Miliband to be Prime Minister, do you? And similar messages to that. And the BES team do seem to be finding, British election study team do seem to be finding significant evidence of a disproportional shift back from UKIP supporters to Conservatives in some of the key marginal seats. So that may have been an important part of it. Another important part, of course, is the fact that the Conservatives had more potentially winnable seats that were currently held by the Liberal Democrats, and what has been labelled by some people slightly tastelessly the Black Widow strategy. I believe this is to do with spiders and their mating rituals. But the Conservatives, having mated with the Liberal Democrats in 2010, then consumed very effectively their mates in 2015. They targeted very effectively lots of Liberal Democrat seats, and to see the scale of that, just go look at a map, particularly in southwest England, and look at, say, the amount of yellow on it in 2010 and the absence of yellow now. That's part of the story, but I think we also need to understand, if the Conservative campaigning was so effective, why was Labour local campaigning so relatively ineffective in 2015? I think this is pretty puzzling because in 2010 that was not the case. In 2010, Labour did disproportionately well in the key marginals, and indeed by doing so denied the Conservatives a majority. So Labour was very effective in local campaigning in 2010. And all through the months and indeed years building up to the election this year, we heard and I saw lots of evidence that the Labour Party was putting a big effort into its local campaigning. Labour were very confident they could outdo the Conservatives in local campaigning, that they had a larger and younger party membership. They would have many more people on, as they termed it, the Labour doorstep. Lord Ashcroft's polls in the key marginal seats very much seemed to be validating them, that Labour was being much more active in the local seats. And indeed, I think we can show some additional new evidence on this. First of all, a couple of slides I showed those of you who were at the pre-election briefing. This is in Wales. We asked people in early March, have you been contacted by someone from a political party about the general election? Well, at that time, about 80% of them said no. Of those who had been contacted, though, Labour had a clear advantage over the Conservatives, Lib Dems, Plaid and UKIP. Now, the British Election Studies campaign survey, which was contacting people during the last 4 weeks of the campaign, asked people, have you been contacted during the previous 4 weeks? By this time, an awful lot of people had been contacted. And we look at then, amongst these people, of those who had been contacted, in the Welsh sample, who had they been contacted by? Well, Labour is still ahead from the Conservatives. Plaid had pulled up their game significantly. But Labour was still ahead in terms of the amount of voter contacts that they were making. And this, I think, really makes the ineffectiveness of Labour's ground game actually all the more puzzling. It wasn't like Labour wasn't doing the work. They were putting in the work on the ground, yet for some reason it wasn't effective. It wasn't persuading significant numbers of people in the places where Labour needed to persuade people. And understanding why that was so, given that Labour had been very effective on the ground in 2010, is going to be a key part of our task of trying to explain the election outcome. I have a few thoughts about this, which we can maybe explore in questions, but that's something that a lot of the detailed research is going to have to try and unpick. Why did Labour's ground game fail pretty abjectly? More generally, in terms of the election outcome, in some senses, this shouldn't have been a surprising election outcome. Probably the main explanatory approach to understanding general elections in Britain and in much of the world these days is one that talks about what they term valence politics. Well, the former students of mine will have heard all too much about. Valence politics basically means competence. Do the voters see you as an effective party to run the country, to run things like the economy, to deliver goals that pretty much everyone agrees on, like a well-run state, well-managed economy and public services? Now, on two key measures of this, the Conservatives had and maintained right through the election significant advantages on ratings of economic competence and management and on ratings of leadership. The Conservatives and David Cameron were significantly ahead of Labour and Miliband, and no governing party has ever lost an election while simultaneously leading on both of these factors. So in some senses, we should have maybe expected the result we got. Of course, it was surprising because that wasn't really quite what the polls had been suggesting for months. Even though the Conservatives were leading on these fundamental factors, nonetheless the polls were also showing a considerable number of people who basically didn't like the Conservative Party very much, and even if they thought they were more competent, were very reluctant to vote for them. And the polls right up to and including on election day were suggesting that we were heading to a hung parliament with a very even balance between Conservative and Labour. So for the polls, where did it all go so wrong is a question that lots of people have been asking since approximately 1 minute after 10 on election night. Well, I think we can certainly specify a little bit more about the where. Where did it all go so wrong? Because actually, the polls didn't go wrong in Scotland. You take an average of the last polls by all of the companies that were polling in Scotland, and they got things pretty much dead on. one or two of them had it SNP a bit too high, one or two a bit too low, but on average they were dead on. And the main picture they got absolutely right. The one regular poll we have in Wales was pretty good as well. We had Plaid and UKIP more or less exactly right. The Lib Dems very close. We just had Labour a little bit, 1 percentage point too high, Conservatives 1 percentage point too low. But again, in Wales, the poll did pretty well. And in England, UKIP was slightly underestimated by the average of the last polls. The Lib Dems and Greens slightly overstated, but again, not by very much. The key problem was Labour and Conservative. That's where the polls went significantly and importantly wrong. In England, the measure of support of Labour and Conservatives, a systematic overestimate of Labour and understatement of the Conservatives. A lot of the polls had Labour and Conservatives just about within the margin of error, but they all had it wrong in the same direction, which is not how margins of error are supposed to work, really. Now, what is going on right now is a very intensive process of review to try and work out why that happened. In terms of the polls getting it wrong, there are basically the two broad categories of explanation. One is that of late swing, is that the polls were basically right up until polling day, and then on election day itself, about 2% of the electorate, 2-3% of the electorate in England couldn't quite face the prospect of an Ed Miliband-run country and shifted to the Conservatives. Now that has a certain plausibility, that explanation. But we have to investigate whether that is true. The other possibility is not that there was a substantial late swing, but simply that the polls were wrong all the way along. They systematically had it for months, maybe even years, wrong in terms of the basic picture of support for the Conservatives and Labour Party. And a whole bunch of us are working through trying to understand exactly where they did go wrong. I actually tend to think it may well have been a little bit of both of those two explanations, that there was some late swing, but also that the polls had been systematically understating the Conservatives, overstating Labour for some time. But the final point on the polls, we need to explain, if the polls had just got everything wrong, if they've been getting things wrong for years, that would be fine in a sense, because okay, the polls are a bit crap and we need to be completely redone. What is really difficult about explaining the failure this year is we need both to explain their failure for the Labour and Conservative parties, but also their success, say, in Scotland and Wales, their success in other recent elections. How could these methods both have got a lot of these other things right and got this wrong? And that is the explanatory task, which is a very difficult one. Final point I want to make before I shut up is for Wales. See, England, the election very clearly extended the divergence of Scottish electoral politics from those in England. It's not clear, I think, actually, that the same is true of Wales. Yes, Welsh elections have always had a significant effect from GB-wide factors. It's not clear that that has become substantially more so, and that Welsh elections are moving ever more sort of in beat with an English drum. I'll just show you a few final, very pretty slides on this. This, first of all, is Conservative electoral support. England, Scotland and Wales, all post-war general elections. Red line is England, blue line is Scotland, green line is Wales. We see basically the red and green lines following almost in parallel pretty much through the entire period. It's almost like they're train tracks going on together. Whereas Scotland, of course, we have this very strange tale where the Tories used to actually do better in Scotland than in England, and now do horrendously badly, with this year their worst ever performance in Scotland. We actually see a little bit more movement in the direction of England when we look at Labour support. Again, green line is Wales, red line is England, blue line is Scotland. And the gap there is rather narrower than the gap here. We put those two things together. The gap between electoral support in England and Wales for Labour and for the Conservatives. Well, the Conservatives, the last two general elections, that gap in support between England and Wales has been the smallest in any post-war election, but there's not a great deal of difference between here and the 1980s or 70s, or even back into the late 50s and 60s. Where we do see some more evidence of convergence actually is with regard to Labour support. And the gap between between Labour support in England and Wales in this general election at 5.3% is the lowest, going back as far as I can find it, certainly back to the pre-war period. So my final very pretty chart is, I know you've been wanting this one, an index of dissimilarity in election results. Basically between England, this is basically dissimilarity from England. So how different from England overall are the election results in Scotland and Wales in every election from 1945? Again, basically this index again runs from 0, where you get exactly the same share of the vote for the parties in England and Wales, or England and Scotland, potentially up to 100, where again, parties that get all of the votes in Scotland get no votes at all in England, say. Basically, up to and including 1970, Scotland was much more similar to England in its electoral preferences at every election. And since February 1974, at every election, Scotland has been more different. But the scale of that difference in the last 2 elections has really taken off enormously. In terms of Wales, I mean, if you can see a very clear historical trend there, can you please point it out to me? Not a great deal is changing. There is a bit of a trend, sort of from about 1992, slightly downwards, but not massively so. So, in terms of Wales converging on England in electoral terms, well, if it is, it ain't doing so by very much. Anyway, that's enough for me for now. We've got some time for questions and discussion. Thanks.